After wishing you a Shavua Tov, we're here on Daf Dalid Amud Beis, and if you count down from the top of the Amud, approximately 7 lines, you'll see Masnisa de Rabbi Meir. Now, the Mishnah tells us that the following gives us a list of Chayavim Bekalbon, and it would seem that if you pay a Machzis HaShekel, then you would have to add a Kalbon. So the Gemara says, Masnisa de Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir holds that unconditionally you have to add a Kalbon as an extra fee when you pay a Machzis HaShekel. When I say unconditionally, I mean even if you gave exact change, which is a Machzis HaShekel, you would still have to add the Kalbon. The Omer Rabbi Meir, and you may recall this was the last sugya that we did at the end of last week. Rabbi Meir holds that Kalbon is a Doraisa. And at the time that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe Rabbeinu that he should collect a Machzis HaShekel, so Moshe Rabbeinu was shown a vision of a Machzis HaShekel. It's called the Mateh Shel H. And he said to Moshe Rabbeinu, Zeh Yitnu, which means Kazeh Yitnu. In other words, our Machzis HaShekel today is not exactly the same, identical with the Machzis HaShekel that was shown to Moshe Rabbeinu in a vision as a Mateh Shel H, because a Mateh Shel H is pure metal without any admixture of what we call sigim. In other words, it's totally nucky, it's refined. So in order to make up the difference between our Machzis HaShekel and the Mateh Shel H, it's necessary to add the Kalbon. So let's pick it up now from the new Gemara, which is a few lines lower down on the Amud. In my Gemara, there are 2 dots, and we're up to Nosan Sela. And now we have a machlokes here between Rabbi Elazar and Rav. The Mishnah says, Nosan Sela litol shekel chayev shnei kulbonos. So what happens is that a person is coming to pay up his due of Machzis HaShekel, but he doesn't have a Machzis HaShekel. He has a Sela, which is a Sela is 2 Machzis HaShekels. So now he has to get change of a Machzis HaShekel. So there's 1 shekel shehu nosein, and there's another shekel that he's notel. In other words, within this Sela, half of the Sela is contributed, that's called nosein, and the other half he receives as change, that's called hu notel. And the Mishnah establishes that in this case he has to pay 2 kolbonos. Now we're going to have a machlokas between Rabbi Elazar and Rav as to whether or not this statement of the Mishnah reflects the unique shita of Rabbi Meir, or would it be the shita that even the Tanakama holds? Again, the machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Tanakama, let's just review, is in a case where he gives exactly a Machzis HaShekel, whereas Rabbi Meir requires that he add a Kalbon in order to make up the discrepancy between that Mateh Shel Eish of Kazeh Yitnu, which was clean of any impurities, any sigim, as opposed to our Machzis HaShekel, which has sigim in it. To make up the difference, he pays a Kalbon, that's Rabbi Meir, and the Tanakama holds no. If there's no need to go to a money changer because he gave exactly a Machzis HaShekel, then the Tanakama holds he doesn't have to add this Kalbon. Amar Rabbi Elazar, the Rabbi Meir. This Mishnah, in the case where he gave a selah and he's receiving a half a shekel as change, and the Mishnah establishes he has to pay 2 kalbonos, says Rabbi Elazar, that reflects the unique shita of Rabbi Meir. But the Chachamim would hold that all he has to pay is 1 kalbon. I'm going to see that Rabbi Elazar quotes a brisa to prove this. The Rabbi Meir Omar echad shekel shu nosein v'echad shekel shu notel, meaning that even though the gizbar only has to do 1 exchange, he's just got to take 1 selah to the money changer, and he'll receive in return 2 machzah shekels. So in that sense, he pays the money changer only 1 commission, which is 1 kalmon. However, Rabbi Meir says that even if you pay exact change with a machzah shekel, you add a kalmon. So now, in this case, where instead of giving a machzah shekel exactly, he gave a selah, he's now going to have to pay 2 kalbonos, according to Rabbi Meir. 1 kalbon for the change, what we call the dmei chalipin, that extra fee that the gizbar will have to pay the money changer to break the seller down into 2 machzios hashekel, and another fee because the Torah itself requires a kalmon to make up the discrepancy in the currency, meaning because our coins are not the same as the original matbeh shel eish of Kozei Yitnu. Whereas according to the Chachamim, meaning the Tanakama Shita, who rejects Rabbi Meir, and he holds that you don't have to add a kalmon to a machzah shekel if it was precisely, then the only basis and machayev for a kalmon is the chilufin. And since there's only 1 chilufin, which is called dmei prita, prita means to be poret, right? Lifrot, even in modern Hebrew use that word. Therefore, he has to pay 1 kalmon. There's no purpose or reason for him to pay 2 kalbonos. The Tanya, we learned in the brisa, elu chayovim bekalmon, and the cases where he gave a selah and he's going to get a machzah shekel in return is kalmon echad. The Tanakama here says explicitly he only has to pay 1 kalmon for the dmei pirut or prita. Rabbi Meir amar shnei kalbonos, because Rabbi Meir holds that in addition to the dmei prita, there's an inherent chiyuv to add a kalbon every time that you give a machzah shekel. That's a doraisa halacha, and therefore you have to give 2 kalbonos. So therefore, Rabbi Elazar rests his case that the Mishnah, that in the case of a seller requires 2 kalbonos, reflects the shita of Rabbi Meir. And now we're up to Rav. Rav disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer, and he's going to maintain that according to Tanakama, in the case of a seller, you have to pay 2 kalbonos, and Rabbi Meir, in the case of a seller, would require 3 kalbonos. And therefore, the Mishnah is according to the Tanakama as well, meaning the Tanakama in this case would also require an extra kalbon. And Rav is going to quote his brisa to support his interpretation. And Mar Rav, in the Yerushalmi, they added the Mar. In the Bavli, we find Mar also very often. Mar Zutra, for example, but in the case of Rav, we never found that additional word Mar, but for Rav's name. But here in the Yerushalmi, it's Mar Rav. And he says that I don't interpret our Mishnah the way Rabbi Eliezer interprets our Mishnah, but rather Divrei HaKolhi, meaning that second kalbon, would be an additional payment that even the Tanakama would agree that you have to pay. and there are two kalbonos. Now, if you recall, Eschatoini Maskir, when we ended the shir on Thursday, I had no clear understanding of why the Tanakama, in the case of a sela, would require two kalmonos. So I'm going to take a shot at it now. And I think the halacha is the following. We mentioned last week a Rashi in Masechet Bechoros on Daf Nun Vav Amid Beis. And Rashi says that there's another reason why a kalbon is an additional payment added even in the case of a machzis hashekel, meaning this is unique to Rashi. Rashi says that, and he's not talking about Rabbi Meir per se. He doesn't introduce this kazeh yitnu svara, that midaraisi you have to add a kalbon. But Rashi says that af yochid hashokel machzis hashekel b'matbeh shel chatzi shekel mosif kalbon. And why is that so? After all, we assumed that the payment of a kalbon, unless you have Rabbi Meir's zeyitnu, dorais halacha, was to offset the loss of the gizbar, who has to be porate a seller. And he has to go to the money changer and add that commission. Here, in the case of a machzis hashekel, that logic doesn't apply. I mean, there's no reason why the gizbar should have to change the machzis hashekel. So this Rashi apparently reflects another Gemara elsewhere in the Masechet Beitza on Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis. But there, the Gemara assumes that the reason for Dmei Chiluf, meaning the reason why you go to a money changer, is not necessarily to break down a larger coin into a smaller coin, but just the opposite. Hoil vashkolim ktanim nochim li abdam v'tzorach lachlifam b'matbeos gedolos Yosef. Interesting. Rashi is offering what I call a punkt paket svara. We understand that the purpose of paying a money changer is to take larger monies and reduce them to smaller monies, smaller currencies, correct? Like, for example, I give out staka, right? I don't know, everybody has their own experience, but here in my local shul here in Har Nof, they come around, Baruch Hashem, there are enough of them, even during the pandemic, So what I do is I sometimes those who collect will be willing to give you change. And by the time, months go around, you get to know each one of them. Some of them come with a big thing. So what I do is I take a larger coin and I break it down into smaller coins. So if you have a 10 shekel coin, you want to break it into 5 shekel coins, etc., etc. But now we're suggesting the exact opposite, that coins tend to get lost. And sometimes those who collect stock are very happy if you'll give them, let's say, a 50 shekel note and ask for 10 for 10 fives or 5 tens, whatever it is, because they don't want to carry around the small change. It's very easy to get lost if you have a hole in your pocket, etc., etc. So there seems to be a two-directional dmei prita. There's a dmei prita which will apply when you come with a seller, and you want to get change of a half a seller, which is a shekel, a matzah shekel. And there the money changer is offering you the service and he's charging you for that to break it down into smaller coins. So you'll get 2 machzah shekel for one seller. But there's also a need for the gizbar as he collects all these funds, and he's got a ton of machzah shekels, which are relatively small coins, and their currency is relatively small amounts, and to change them for larger coins. So therefore, in the case of a seller, the gizbar could incur a double fee in order to protect himself. Number one, there's we'll call it the zeh notel. Zeh notel means that the donor wants to get back a half a shekel. So in that case, there's a fee of breaking down the shekel. I'm sorry, the selah into 2 half shekels. That's called Zen Notel. And then there's the nosen, meaning the donor, insofar as he is giving smaller currencies to the gizbar is now collecting vast amounts and volumes of small currencies, and this would apply even to the chatzi shekel itself. There's going to be a dmei prita when the gizbar, after he accumulates X number of machzah shekels, he's going to now take it to the money changer and say, give me a larger coin. Whatever the largest coin is, I don't know. Maybe it's a dinar zav. A lot of this you have to learn Perkas Zav for this. The issue of ribis, when you change money, so forth and so on. Let's say I borrowed from you, a half a dinar of kesef, and now you're going to pay me back with a dinar of zav. Is there any issue of ribis? That's Perkas Zav. So now it comes out that in the case of a person who contributes a selah, Rabbi Meir is going to hold there are 3 kalbonos. The Tanakama will have 2 kalbonos. The Tanakama's 2 kalbonos will both be for dmei prita, for the exchange fee, but in both directions. To take the larger seller, break it down into 2 machzah shekels, and then the machzah shekel that he receives from these 2 machzah shekels, that also requires dmei prita to exchange them for larger coins. Rabbi Meir has an additional 3rd kalbon because of the change in the machzah shekel itself between the matbeh shel eish zeh yitnu and our machzah shekel that we have today, which is full of sigim and is not pure metal, without refined metal, and it's not the same as the original machzah shekel that was shown to Moshe Rabbeinu. Al daite de Rav, according to the logic of Rav, shlosha kolbonos inun. According to Rabbi Meir, we should have 3 kolbonos. The Tanakama will only have 2 kolbonos. Also, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Shmuel bar Yitzchak b'shem Rav. In other words, Rabbi Meir came together with Rabbi Shmuel, and they both quoted Rav, and they said that according to Rabbi Meir, shlosha kolbonos inun, echad shekel shu nosei v'echad shekel shu notel. So 1 shekel shehu nosem, which means that the gizbar is left with, as we said before, massive amounts of coins that he has to exchange for larger coins. Echad shekel shu notel, and now there's a kalbon for the shekel that's given to the donor so that he can now fulfill his mitzvah. I don't know if it has to go back and forth, but he fulfills his mitzvah machzah shekel. And that's a dmei prita. That is money that you pay to the money changer in order to break it down from a larger coin to a smaller coin. The echad and a 3rd kalmon, according to Rabbi Meir, lidvar Torah. As we said before, to make up the discrepancy between the matbeh shel H and our matbeh. Okay, then, so that's a hashlama. This is what I wanted to add to our discussion of last week, and now we begin the sugya of shutfus for today. That's the brand new sugya. And the reason I wanted to add this is because I left it hanging on Thursday. I really couldn't figure out why the Tanakama, according to Rav Shita, would require two kalbonos in the case where he pays with the seller. Okay. Now, the Mishnah, if you recall, which again we learned the Mishnah, it's almost a week ago. It's always good to recall what we learned in the Mishnah. That when it comes to Masechet Shekel, in its relationship to Meiser Behema, there's an inverse relationship. And in one scenario, you're going to be chayav kalbon, and you're going to be potter from maser. And in the other situation, you're going to be chayav in maser and potter from kalbon. And the Mishnah establishes that it always works in the opposite direction. So, for example, ha'achim v'ashutfim shechayovim bekalbon turim mimaiser behema. Okay. Now, there's a girsa problem here about achim and shutfa. The Rambam, in his girsa, he has an extra vav, and it's ha'achim ve'hashutfim. And that's how we have it also. However, our girsa, not here in the Gemara, but in the Mishnah, has achim shutfim, or ha'achim hashutfim, which means that we're not dealing with two categories, but rather with one category of achim who are shutfim. Okay. Now, what happens is, in the case of achim, the father dies, and he leaves an estate. And in the estate, there are animals which are called behemos tahoros, and there are at least 10 of them. And there's halacha of meiser behema, which means that every 10th animal that comes out of the corral, asiri kodesh, and you're chayav to give them to the Kohen. However, the classic case of Meiser Behema is not the case of Achim. It's the case of a person who owns 10 animals. Not that he inherited them from the estate of his father. And the Torah tells us that in the case of shutfim, of partners in an animal, you're potter from Meiser Behema. And there's no parallel with regard to the kalba. And shutfim will pay the kalba. Now, let me just go back for a second to the pasuk. Yeah. The pasuk is in Shmos Perek Yud Gimel, at the end of Parshas Bo, B'chol Peter Sheger Behema Asher Yeh Lecha Hazcharim Lashem. And the Gemara derives in B'choros Daf Nun Vav, Lecha Yeh Lecha V'lo Shel Shutfim. And therefore, if you have Shutfim, they're potter from Meiser Behema. Now, in the case of Machzis HaShekel, on the contrary, as we've said before, Shutfim are obligated to pay Kalbon. And that would mean that, let's say you had two Shutfim, and they brought a shekel together. So they they have a partnership in a shekel, and they brought the shekel to the gizbar as payment to the machzah shekel, they have to add a kalma. There's no such parallel ptur of shutfim. That ptur of shutfim yelecha is unique to meiser behema tahora. Oh, now what happens? The Mishnah describes a case where Yaakov dies and he leaves, let's say, Ruvain and Shimon. And they now inherit the flock. We'll see later on there's a difference between goats and sheep, but we're not up to that yet. So let's just in a general sense. So they inherit the flock, and then they went ahead and they divided the flock. Now, stage number one before the Chalukah is called Tfutzas Habayis, in which we view the father as if Yaakov was still alive. He's holding on to the Yerusha Kaviyachol on behalf of Reuven and Shimon. Then at stage two, we get down to the actual Chalukah, and Reuven took his portion and Shimon his. Then Nishtatfu. Then they went back and they became partners again. Now, as long as they're partners from Meiser Behema, because the Yelecha below shel Shutfim. However, if they're partners now in a Machzas HaShekel, when they give that Machzas Shekel, they have to add a kalba. So the inverse relationship means that the ptur of Maser Behema mitzad Shutfis will generate, in the case of Machzas Shekel, a chiyuv kalba. Now we get to the reverse case, where you're chayav in Meiser Behema and potter from kalba. What's that? They did not divide up the Yerusha. And now we're going to see a unique reason why there's no payment of a kalbon in this case, if they didn't divide up the Yerusha. Because of the halacha and the principle of tfusas habayis. In other words, from the moment of the death of Yaakov, the Morich, until the actual Chalukah, the property, the possessions are in the hands of Yaakov. Again, this is all conceptual. Obviously, Yaakov is gone. But he's holding on to it on behalf of the Yarshim. Therefore, there's no payment of Kalmon. Why? Because the actual mitzvah, the obligation to pay the Machzah Shekel is incumbent upon Reuven and Shimon. I mean, Yaakov is part of the mitzvahs. But Yaakov, in effect, again, in the conceptual halachic world, is paying the Kalmon on behalf of Reuven and Shimon. He offers, I'm sorry, I said paying the Kalmon. Cross that out. I meant to say he's paying the Machzah Shekel on behalf of Reuven and Shimon. And the halacha is that when you pay a Machzah Shekel on behalf of someone else, we exempt you from the extra payment of the Kalma. That's your payoff. We give you a reward because you, in a very magnanimous way, you paid and offered the Machzah Shekel as a payment on behalf of someone else to pater up someone else who's a bar chiyuv. So therefore, Dafka in this case, because they were shokel together, one shekel on behalf of the two Yarshim, there is a ptur, an exemption from Kalma. But as far as Meiser Behem is concerned, since all the money and all the animals are Bechezkas Aviem, by virtue of this concept called Tfusas Habayis, therefore there's no ptur of Lecha v'lo Shutfin. There's no Shutfis here. And this is the case of Lo Chilku, which means that we're back at stage one during that time period after the death of the father, before the actual division of his possessions. Okay. Now we get to the next level, and that is breaking down the animals in the estate of Yaakov into categories or species. Omar Rab Lazar, this din that is in the Resha, that the Achim, after the Chalukah, when they rejoin in a partnership agreement, they are partner from Ma'aser Behema, says Rabbi Lazar, that doesn't always apply. It applies when the father left behind two different species of animals. Now, what happens is that if there are two species of animals, I'll give an example in a second of Izim and Gidim, okay? I'm sorry, of Izim and Tyoshim. Okay, we'll get to that in a minute. I don't want to get distracted now with the specifics. I just want to get the general concept. So what happened is that there's something called Mishpat HaYerusha. Mishpat HaYerusha means that according to the laws of Yerusha, every single species, which has a number of animals in it, so for example, let's say you have a number of Gdiyim. Gdiyim are kids, right? It's like in Korban Pesach, you bring a Gdi, which is a young goat. So each one of those young goats is now, I don't know, I'm using a bad word, but is owned, so to speak. There are rights for every single Yoresh to each one individually of the Gedim. Every Gedi, so that Reuven could claim, I want to get half of the Gedi, and Shimon could say, I want to get half of the Gedi. And what do they do? According to Mishpat HaYerusha, each one, as we said before, should get his chelek, shava b'shava, in every single species. So let's say, for example, in Izim, we have young goats that are called Gediyim. And then when we get to, for example, we get to sheep. So the young sheep are called taya. A young sheep is called a tayash, or young lamb, I should say, maybe tayashim. Vehem shecholku. They made a change in the Mishpat HaYerusha. And what they decide to do is each one would get one species. So let's say Gedim Keneged Tyoshim. Ruvain would get the Gedim, Shimon would get the Tyoshim, and Tyoshim Keneged Gedim, which means they would evaluate on the market how much is a Gedi sell for, how much is a Tayash sold for. And in that way, they would work it out that they each get an equal share in the Yerusha. But what they did is they split the Gedim and the Tyoshim. So Reuven got the Gedim and Shimon got the Tyoshim. And in that way, they sort of undermined, which is fine because the Dini Mammon is called Tanaishim Mammon Kayam, the normal law of Mishpat HaYerusha. So the interpretation of this statement of Rabbi Lezer, is offered by Rashi there in Masechet Bechoros, and he says the following: Hareza ki'ilu kol echad kana mi echav mi achiv es chelko b'min habehemos shekibel uli achar mikan chazu v'nishtatfu v'azanu omrim shavlados sheyeshnam b'shas hachaluka pturim mimasa behema midin lo kuach v'osan shenoldu liachar shechazu v'nishtatfu pturim midin shutfus. Okay. So let's try to understand. Again, we're focused on the Reisha case where the Mishnah establishes that the Achim kishecholku v'nishtatfu are potur from Meiser Behema. So Rashi says, why they potur from Meiser Behema? Because we see it as if each one purchased something from his friend. Why? Because let's say Shimon takes the tayash, right, again, whichever one is worth more. Let me say this. Let's say that a gedi is worth 2 tayashim, just for the sake of, l'saber ta'ozen. So what happens is that Ruvain is going to get the gedi, and he's buying half of the gedi from Shimon, because Shimon should get half of that gedi, and he pays him by giving him 2 tayashim, which are worth 1 gedi. It's not so simple because you'd have to multiply it. But in any event, you get the general idea that when they're making this exchange, it's a barter exchange. That's called lakuach. So Rabbi Loza says in Hilchas Meiser Behema, there are 2 pturim. One ptur is lakuach, and the other is shutfis. So lakuach means when I buy your animal, I don't have to count it in the other animals that I own to be mitzuraf to the asara, to the 10 for the chiyuv of Maser Behema. Lakuach is potter. But we'll have to see. That's a Gemara in Bava Metzia that derives, and Bechoros that derives the ptur of lakuach in Masros. That's true for all Masros, by the way, not just Maser Behema. Now, although it's true that the first generation of Gediyim and Tayashim are patur because of lakuach, under normal conditions, the next generation, so let's say Ruvain took the Gedi grows up, it becomes an A's, and then it has a child, that Vlad is chayav in Maser Behema. And the same is true for Shimon's Tiyashim. When they become older, they become tzon. But the Mishnah says, Kshecholku, and then Chazru v'nishtakfu. The Mishnah is talking about a case where later on they set up a shutfis. So with regard to the Vlados, the next generation, although we don't have a ptur of lakuach, but we have a ptur of lo v'lo shutfin. Gia lo v'lo l'shutfin. So this is the way Rashi interprets our Mishnah in the light of Rebbe Lazar. Aval, says Rebbe Lazar, im chilku gediyim keneged gediyim u'tyoshim keneged tyoshim. If, on the other hand, what's going to happen is that we go back to the primary mishpat hayerusha, in which case both Reuven and Shimon will inherit Gediyim and Tyoshim. That was the original mishpat hayerusha. Then there will be a chiyuv of Maser Behema. Why? Because hu chelko misha harishona, which means the following: that when they do a chalukah, in this case, then the chalukah clarifies who gets to take home which Gediyim and who gets to take home which Tyoshim. But whatever he takes home, that was part of the original Yerusha. And if that's part of the original Yerusha, again, reading, he says the following: Din Yerusha Yeshkan. There's no din of Mekach over here. Kishechozer ma'achim ishtatfim chozer atzav l'kadmuso shehakol nimtza b'shus aviyah v'yein avlados sheyeshna b'shas chaluka peturim midin lakuach. Even shechazru v'nishtatfu avlados einam peturim mishum shutfus. Rabbi Elazar says in this case, mimanavshach there's no petur. There's no petur of shutfus and there's no petur of lakuach. Why? Because, again, since everyone, according to the Mishpat HaYerusha, deserves from each min, so we're going to say that after they do the Chalukah, now we clarify exactly what was the Din Yerusha back at the time of the death of the father. Meaning that if, let's say, Reuven takes home this animal, this Gedi, and Shimon takes home this Gedi, and Reuven takes home this Tayash, and Shimon this Tayash. That's really nothing more than the original Yerusha as it existed at the time of the death of the father. And therefore, that's not considered shutfus. Why? Because we're going back to the original situation as it existed at the time of the death of the father, which is a tfusas habayis. And tfusas habayis is not shutfus, as we said before. So therefore, there's no ptur of shutfus. Okay? And again, certainly there's no ptur of lakuach, because no one is buying out the other chelek of his ko-yoresh, of his brother. So there's no din kinyan, but rather there's a din Yerusha. Now later on, the brothers decided to have a shutfus. Why isn't there a ptur of shutfin? And kishechozu na'achim, which takvim, what they're doing is they're saying that, you know what? We're not going to bother with chalukah. Even though we made a chalukah, but that chalukah was only to clarify who would get the original Yerusha from the father. But now we decide, forget about the chalukah. Let's become shutfim. If we're becoming shutfim, then choser hamatzav lekadmuso, we're going back to the original Yerusha. So mimonavshach, there's no ptur. There will be a chiyuv masa. Why? Because if we go back to the moment of chalukah, the moment of chalukah is just a moment in which they clarify which one takes home which gedi, and which one takes home which tayish. But it's the original chalukah reflecting back on the moment of the death of the father. So that's not called lakuach. No one's buying anything. It's not like the Reisha of Rabbi Elazar. In the Reisha of Rabbi Elazar, Reuven has rights to Gedi, and Reuven allows a barter exchange in which Shimon will give him a tayash instead of a Gedi, or a Gedi instead of a tayash. That's called the ptur of lakuach. But here, if we're talking about a case where they're splitting up the Gedim and the tayashim, then that's not lakuach. They're just going back to the original Yerusha, which the Mishpat Yerusha was that each one gets both Gedim and tayashim. And therefore, there's no ptur of lakuach. There's no ptur of shutfis, because this is not a case of shutfis. This is a case of tfusas habayis. And if you'll ask, well, what about the next generation? After they decided to do a shutfis, Rabbi Elazar's opinion is that shutfis is nothing more than reestablishing the, as I said, choser matzav lekadmuso, the original Yerusha. Again, Rabbi Elazar, I apologize. It's not an easy Gemara. This is very conceptual, very abstract. Now, Rabbi Yochanan is going to disagree with Rabbi Elazar on the following count. We can only understand Rabbi Elazar, says Rabbi Yochanan, based on a principle called Yesh Brera, which means that at stage, we'll call it number 2, which is the stage of Chalukah, that Chalukah is only a Brera where retroactively it clarifies which Gedi is Reuven going to take home and which Gedi is Shimon going to take home, which Tayash is. But Rabbi Yochanan holds Ein Brera, that we don't say that something that's up in the air and it's undefined and unspecified will later on retroactively be specified. Rabbi Yochanan, Afilu Chalku Gediyim Keneged Gediyim Utiyashim Keneged Tiyashim. Nevertheless, Kiluch Kuchosheim Upturim in Amase. Rabbi Yochanan insists that there is a ptur of lakuach, whereas Rabbi Elazar holds yesh brera, and therefore there's no ptur of lakuach, because when we're splitting up Gediyim, Keneged Gediyim, and Tiyashim, says Rabbi Elazar, in effect, there's no mekach over here, there's no barter exchange. We're just going back to clarify the original Yerusha. Rabbi Yochanan doesn't tolerate that. He holds Ein Brera. And if Ein Brera, then the Chalukah starts a brand new Masechet Shekalim. And within that context, what we have is a ptur of lakuach. Right? Because now Reuven is acquiring ownership on something that was not his. It wasn't a clarification of the original Yerusha. And whenever you acquire ownership on something that's not yours, you're potem in a masa because of the halacha of lakua. And kahudis ninon taman, and therefore Rabbi Yochanan equates this case of gediyim tachas gediyim and tiyoshim tachas keneged tiyoshim as the Mishnah Bechoros establishes halakuach is potem masa be'ema. Anything that you acquire is exempt from Maisa Behema. Now, I asked you before, and I didn't know the answer to that question. How do we know that lakuach, when you acquire ownership on something, in a case of an animal, you're not chayav in Maisa Behema? So again, we go back to Shmos, and there the Torah says, Bechar Banecha. Now again, now we're learning the laws of Bechar. Until now we were talking about Maisa Behema. But the Bechar is also one of the Matnas Kahuna that you have to give to the Kohen. And there it says, Bechar Banecha Titain Li. And then it says in the Pasuk, Kain Tasel Sharchel Etzonecha. And the Gemara derives from the word Banecha. Why does it have to say Bechar Banecha? It could have said Becharcha Titain Li. Is ma banech lo shaykh din bechora bilakicha matana, right? Let's say you buy a bechar, you're not chayav in bechar. The halacha of bechar is that the bechar was born to your flock. The firstborn of your flock you have to give to the Kohen. But in a case where you purchase or you receive the gift of a bechar, and lo noldu etzlo, the bechar was not born in your possession under your auspices in your flock, is so too sharcha v'tzonacha. There's no din of a chiyuv of lakuach and matana. And the Gemara Bechoros that quotes that on this Mishnah in Bechoros that the Mishnah establishes lakuach is parted from, or matana is parted from bechar. The Gemara has a special yalfusa to equate bechar with maseh. And just like bechar is parted in lakuach or matana, because the bechar wasn't born in his flock, so too in the case of Maisa Behema, there's a ptur of lakuach and matana. Now, Rabbi Yochanan says that when Reuven inherits a particular gedi, meaning after the Chalukah, it's as if he acquired ownership on something that was not his. And therefore it has the din of lakuach and matan. It's part of a maser behema. Whereas Rabbi Elazar says, no, this is not an acquisition. This is simply the original tfusas habayis. These are dini Yerusha. It's not din of Mecca. So again, Rabbi Yochanan says that the chalukah is a Mecca. And when we divvy up the Gediyim, even in a case where Reuven gets Gediyim and Shimon gets Gediyim, they just decide which Gediyim is going to go, and they maybe arbitrarily they divvy it up. In land, again, there are different halachas about how to divvy it up. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, this is a brand new Mecca. This is, again, it's not a Mecca in the sense of a barter deal. Maybe it's more similar to a matana, but it's an acquisition. Reuven didn't own that Gedi, and Shimon didn't own this Gedi. And now, through the process of Chalukah, each one of the two brothers, the heirs, inherited and made an acquisition on his particular Gedi. And therefore, he's parted from Masa Behema. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer sees the Chalukah under the auspices of Brera as clarifying exactly which was the Yerusha. We didn't know whether Reuven was Yorish this particular Gedi and Shimon this particular Gedi. We clarify that through the process of Chalukah. A Chalukah is not a kinyan, but rather a clarification of Yerusha. And when it comes to Yerusha, there's no p'tur of Maser Behema, as we said before, because the Yerusha really is Yaakov Avinu is still alive, and he is simply representing the entire Tfusas Habayis, but there's no Mekach over here. Like, take for example, just l'saber to Ozen. You can have a 1-day-old baby that inherits whatever the child inherits. This is not a kinyan. A child doesn't make kinyanim. Again, it could be dasacharis machna, I understand, but just in theory, this is Yerusha. Yerusha is a different kind of thing. Yerusha means that the Yoresh, the heir, steps into the shoes of the Morish. It's not a process of transaction, of acquisition, going from one bailus to another bailus. Comes along Rabbi Yochanan, and he says, nay, that's not true. When there's a chalukah, Reuven is getting something that was not his. Through the process of chalukah, he's making an acquisition. It's lakua, and it's part of a masa. Comes along Rabbi Elazar, he says, no, chalukah is only a technicality because we're going to apply the principle of brera, and we're going to say that the chalukah is only a brera to clarify the original tfusas habayis, the original Yerusha. So it's not a matter of kinyan. It's not that Reuven is now acquiring ownership for the first time over a Gedi or over a Tayash, but rather Reuven is now, through the process of Chaluk, inheriting that Gedi or that Tayash. And when it comes to inheritance, there's no p'tur of Ma'aser Behema. So that's the sugya of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan. All right, what I want to do now in the next 5 minutes is just at least begin with an introduction to the next part of the sugya, which is really, it's not a brand new sugya, it's just a continuation of the sugya that we started. And what the Gemara wants to do now is come up with scenarios where the opposite is true. Like, it's like a double negative. It's a minus of a minus and therefore positive, meaning until now we've been discussing scenarios with one negative, which means that you're chayav in meiser and potter from kablan, from kalbon, or the opposite, you're potter from kalbon and you're chayav in mas. Now the Gemara wants to present scenarios in which you're chayav in both or you're potter in both. Rabbi Chia Omar, Rabbi Yirmiyah boy. So Rabbi Chia reports that Rabbi Yirmiyah had a suffix. because the Mishnah only quotes scenarios in which there's a chiyuv maser and a ptur kalbon, and the reverse of a chiyuv kalbon and a ptur mas. V'lama lesnon amrin. Why didn't the Brisa bring another two possible scenarios? And in those two scenarios, pa'amim shehein chayavim b'zeh b'zeh, and on Daf Hey and Aleph, upa'amim shehein p'turim b'zeh b'zeh. And the Gemara now is going to try to analyze Rabbi Yirmiyah's suffix. Why did Rabbi Yirmiyah think that there were another two scenarios where you're either chayiv in both maser and kalbon or potter in both maser and kalbon? Hey chavida, what are these scenarios? And there got to be two scenarios in which they're chayiv in both maser and kalbon or potter in both. Okay. So the Gemara clarifies the following. Cholku means achim shecholku. Nechasim, and nechasim means either currency or hard property. And now they became shutfim again after the chalukah. V'lo cholku habehema. They didn't divvy up the animals. They only divvied up the currency. Chayovim b'zeh b'zeh. In Masechet Shekalim, they chayav kalbon, as any shutfim are chayav in kalbon. And in Masechet Behema, they're going to be chayav because they never did a chalukah. And if they didn't do a chalukah, then all the animals are b'cheskes aviyam, the tfusas habayis, and there's no ptur of lecha v'lo shutfim. Now I'll give you another scenario. Cholku habehema v'lo cholku es hanechasim. They divvied up the animals and they never divvied up the currency. In this case, pturim mizeh mizeh. Why? They'll be part for the Masechet shekel because since they never divided up the currency, therefore the father, in effect, the late father, is doing the shkila. He is offering to pay from the tfus habayis their chiyuv shkolim. There's no halma. On the other hand, they're also part from Masechet Behema because they did a chalukah on the behemos, and then later on they became shutf. Amar Rabbi Mana, hada'at amrit. In what case do you say that there was cholku as a behema v'lo cholku as hanechasim? You know, why would they have gone through a division of the animals and not of the currency? And he says that bishalo haisa habehema rov, avolim haisa behema rov hein ikar hanechas. Rabbi Mana injects into the equation a new variable, the variable of rov, and he says the following: you just told me in analyzing Rabbi Yirmiyah's suffix that if they did a division on the animals but not on the currency, they're part from everything. That's only in the case of shelo haisa behema rov. That if we take an analysis of the nechasim and we estimate their value, the behemos are not rov. They are the mute of the nechasim, or maybe 50-50. Therefore, even though they divvied up the behemos, they still remain potter from kalmon because the Masechet shekel is coming from the nechasim, and they didn't make a chaluk on the Masechet shekel. Do you follow? There's this idea of Rabbi Yirmiyah that they didn't make a chalukah on the nechasim as opposed to the behemos, meaning nechasim here means currency. That's because the currency represents the rov. Aval im haisa behema rov, harei hein ikar nechasim. If they do a chalukah on the behemos, and the behemos represent most of the possessions, then it's as if there was a chalukah even on the currency. And if there was a chalukah on the currency, as we said before, the chayv and kalma. So Rabbi Mana really restricts or makes it conditional. When do you say that the chalukah on the behemos and then they were choser v'shutvim is there for their potter from behema, and at the same time they'll be potter from the kalmon because there was never a chalukah on the kalmon. I'm sorry, on the nechasim, and therefore the father is in effect paying the Masechet Shekalim on behalf of the sons. That's because the nechasim represent the mute, so then, so to speak, batel. But if no, I'm sorry, just the opposite, because the nechasim represent the rov and they're not batel. If the nechasim represent the rov and they're not batel, then we could say there was no chalukah on the nechasim. But in a case where the nechasim are the rov, right? I'm sorry. In a case where the nechasim are the mute and the behema is the rov, and they went ahead and they did a chalukah on the behema, and that's why they're potter from masa behema, then in such a case they'll be chayav in kalbon because we view them already as shutfim on the nechasim, as if to say there was a chalukah on the nechasim. And why is that? Because once there was a chalukah on the behemos and the behemos rove, then we view the entire estate of the father as if it was already divvied up. And once it's divvied up, as we said over and over again, there's a chiyuv to pay kalbon. So we're up to Rabbi Ovid, and that Emir Hashem will pick up tomorrow. And that this Rabbi Ovid will put Emir Hashem the entire sugya into perspective. Okay, then. Just wishing you a great day. Thank you so much.